Hello, everybody, and welcome to Breakout Session 1 on Adverse Childhood Experiences. What do we and what do we do? What don't we know, and what next? I'm Kelly Beaver. I am a trustee of the Early Intervention Foundation and also managing director of the Social Research Institute at Ipsos Mori. It's lovely to be chairing this session today. The session is predominantly about early adverse childhood experiences, and in particular this is an issue that the sector is really grappling with but also really focused on. It's a great opportunity today to bring practitioners, those involved in national policy and the production and use of evidence together to really have an engaged and informative conversation about what we really do and don't know and how we take things forward. So today I have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you, and then we'll also have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So please do think about what you want to ask our panelists, either individually or as a collective, and send them through the chat function. So firstly, we're going to hear from Dr. Kirsten Asmussen, who is Head of What Works for Child Development at EIF. So Kirsten's a development psychologist with expertise in parent and child relationships, and she authored Evidence-Based Parenting Practitioners Handbook back in 2011, which I'm sure was a labour of love. She is now at the EIF and will tell us a little bit about some of the work that they've produced earlier this year on early adverse childhood experiences. Next up, we're going to have Laurel Brown, who's a principal consultant at Laurel Brown Consultancy Services. She's a JNC qualified youth practitioner with over 18 years practice experience acquired from a range of children and young people services and sectors, including education, children's social care, youth offending, third sector, and also youth work. Following her, we're going to hear from Dan Johnson, and Dan's clinical director at the Kibble Education and Care Centre. He's also a forensic psychologist and chair of the Scottish branch of the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health. And lastly, but certainly not least, we are going to hear from Dr. Vashti Berry, who is Children and Young Persons Mental Health Research Collaboration Director at the University of Exeter. She's also worked a lot in intervention development and evaluation research for families experiencing adversity. So we have a fantastic lineup for you today. Each of our speakers will have between 5 and 8 minutes, and so please do get your questions at the ready at the end as well. So we're going to go to Kirsten, first of all, who can talk us through her perspective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, before I launch into what we do and don't know, I'm going to describe briefly what ACEs are, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Adverse childhood experiences, the term came to prominence in 1998 after a study that retrospectively asked a rather large population of adults about their history of a series of negative childhood events involving 5 forms of serious child maltreatment, which are punishable by law in most countries, and 5 forms of family dysfunction, which include things like parental separation, parental mental health problems, and parental substance misuse problems. And the study then compared their answers to their current health status. And it found that when 4 or more of these negative childhood events were present, in any combination, there was a significantly increased risk of a variety of life-threatening health conditions, which include cancer, stroke, and heart disease, as well as serious mental health problems such as chronic depression. So this finding has been replicated in retrospective surveys with adults in a variety of countries now. But yet the interpretation of this finding has been quite controversial, actually. That has to do with some limitations of the evidence base in particular. So last year, the Early Intervention Foundation decided to conduct a review, a comprehensive review of the evidence because of this controversy and because we wanted to really understand where the strengths and weaknesses in the evidence lay. And our review concluded that research into adverse childhood experiences has really helpfully increased awareness of the negative impact early adversity can have on children's development. But on the other hand, we believe that some of the narrative that has followed has led to some interpretations of the study that involve serious misconceptions about the nature of childhood adversity, its relationship to negative adult outcomes, and the appropriateness of some ACE-related practices. And these misconceptions are rooted in the overconfidence in the design of the ACE studies, which has methodological limitations that seriously restrict what we can say with any confidence. And happy to field questions about these limitations in the chat. We go into them in great depth in the report. But here, what can I say with any confidence about what we know about adverse childhood experiences and their relationship to adult outcomes? Well, I think we can say that ACEs are bad regardless of their impact on adult outcomes, okay? There's no question that they cause high degrees of suffering and trauma, and for this reason alone, they need to be stopped and prevented. Okay, there's no question about that. I think we can also say with a high degree of confidence that the presence of any ACE actually is associated with mental health problems. Whether or not that's causal, that's still up in the air, but there is a strong association that still exists in methodologically robust studies. So we can be quite confident about that. But the other thing we need to be clear about is that the majority of children who have experienced ACEs, including those who have experienced 4 or more, go on to lead happy and healthy adult lives. So while it increases the risk, it's not inevitable. It does not determine these outcomes. And I think that this is a really important point that has been lost in some recent debates. And the other thing that we do not know is that while ACEs elevate the risk of these mental health problems, we don't know if to the extent at which it is the ACEs itself or the factors that commonly occur with ACEs, which include poverty, living in cramped housing, community violence, and in fact, racial discrimination. In fact, studies show that some of these other adversities that are not in the ACE counts contributed to poor adult outcomes, particularly physical adult outcomes, more so than having a history of 4 or more ACEs. Our review also observed that many ACE-related practices, such as universal ACE screening, are not supported by robust evidence. ACE screening is increasingly being used to make diagnostic decisions about individual adults and children, as well as encouraging them to seek help, with the belief that being asked about ACEs may have a therapeutic effect. However, in our review, we could find no strong evidence to support this theory or practices. In fact, findings from the most robust studies suggest that most vulnerable individuals, and these are those who've experienced 4 or more ACEs, don't feel comfortable answering these questions, and some even find them stigmatizing. Additionally, international task forces, as well as the World Health Organization, have observed that it is unethical to screen for conditions in the absence of standard screening protocols or a clear referral route to treatments with clear evidence. In this respect, it's worth noting that a panel of epidemiological experts, including one of the original ACE authors, recently released a statement in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, after our report actually, advising that ACE scores not be used to inform treatment decisions for individual adults and children. The authors further acknowledged that the diagnostic specificity of the ACE questions and ACE scores had not been established, and it was inappropriate to determine individual risk on the basis of population estimates, which is what the ACE study offered. The statement also verified that while a number of poor health conditions are associated with an increased number of ACEs, most of these conditions are in fact caused by factors other than ACEs. So they've kind of walked back some of their original claims. For these reasons, we advocate in our report that more research be conducted to establish the diagnostic validity of ACE screening activities before they are put into widespread use. But in the meantime, we also recommend that more interventions with strong evidence of preventing, reducing, or stopping ACEs be made available to the children and parents who need them the most. In our report, we in fact identify 33 interventions with strong evidence that could be made available fairly quickly if the right resources were in place. And finally, we believe that a concerted national effort is necessary to address the wider social and economic conditions known to contribute to ACEs. This effort should include policies that address poverty and community crime, as well as resources for strengthening our national and local systems so they are better able to respond to ACEs when they unfortunately do occur.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kirsten. So that's an incredibly useful review of a piece of work produced by EIF back in the early part of this year, just about what we do know. And that piece of work is really a very important landmark piece. And I'm sure some of the other speakers will comment on some of the comments within it. So we'll go to Laurel, who will talk next and give us her perspective on what we know, what we don't, and where next. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, definitely, we'll pick up on a couple of points raised there by Kirsten. I think it's helpful for me to just set the context in terms of how I'm approaching my contribution to the conversation, which is threefold. Primarily as a practitioner with experience in frontline services in London, but also outside of London. So in terms of the demographic of the kind of children and families that I've worked with, we have seen differences. And, you know, I think that is something that does need to be, that is important and needs to be considered in this conversation. And I'll come on to that some more in a moment. But in addition, as a Black woman who, due to the number of ACEs that I actually experienced in my childhood, allegedly, I'm far more likely to experience a range of negative outcomes in my adult life. So I'm YOLO every day until, God forbid, I get a diagnosis or some horrible life outcome. But also as a Black professional in the children and young people sector, who often is the only person in the room highlighting the impact of structural oppression and discrimination and the ramifications, therefore, of these on adversities for children and young people and their experiences of trauma. So I've got some notes to help me keep to time, because I know we've only got 5 to 8 minutes. I can wax more on this topic. So I think for me, when we talk about ACEs and what we do and don't know, there are many myths personally, and that I feel have emerged off the back of the dominant research. And Kirsten obviously just demonstrated there that there's even been changes in what we have been told and what we have been led to believe for a long time around this topic. And I think that there is a simplicity in the approach. It's too simplistic approach in my experience in services. And I think there are 3 areas where this is quite obvious to me. So the first is that the experience of children and young people from Black and minoritized backgrounds is assumed as equal quite often when we have conversations around the application of ACEs literature and the development of interventions for children and families. In addition, the capacity of professionals to recognise and mitigate the way in which their own biases shape the care and support they provide to these children and young people, I think, again, is not captured in the discourse that surrounds ACEs and the way we support children and young people. And lastly, I think we assume there is a baseline approach within services, which includes anti-racism, anti-oppressive practice, anti-discriminatory practice as standard, which often there isn't. So in my firm, what we do as a consultancy team is work with services to review the lens that they're applying to their work and to look at how they can hone inclusive practice, anti-oppressive practice, anti-discriminatory practice, because it's just not there in almost all of the services that we support. And this is statutory services, children's social care, mental health services for children and young people, fostering agencies. We work with a broad spectrum of organisations that support children and young people who would be deemed to be experiencing adversity of some sort, and numerous ACEs. So I think by and large, we all agree, obviously, that ACEs are bad. The negative impacts that you have experienced in childhood will impact on your neurological, emotional, social development potentially. It's well documented, but what isn't well documented for me, and where we have a huge gap, is what if your adversity is racism? Because unlike other experiences, intrafamilial experiences such as, neglect in the home, when you progress through your life course, at some point it's safe to assume you will leave that environment. But with racism, you can't escape it. It is a lifelong experience. So quite often when I'm presented with statistics and information, evidence bases that have been developed pertaining to ACEs and trauma, I find it difficult to differentiate between what is correlation based on that experience in childhood, which has ended, and what is actually a persistent experience of structural and systemic oppression now. So that's the first thing where I think we take a far too simplistic approach. In addition, I think there is a better understanding of risk and protective factors associated with ACEs, especially compared to when probably all of us first started out in our careers. However, I think where we are lacking is that interrogation of what this means for different children, young people and families. I think it is a kind of a heterogeneous lens that's applied, and we don't take an intersectional approach when we apply this literature, this evidence base. So just a couple of points to make before my time is up. I think that, as I mentioned, I think there are some serious limitations in the evidence base around ACEs, specifically in terms of how inequalities intersect and what that means for the children, young people, families that I work with in my work. For example, we were led to believe if you had 4 or more ACEs, and even in recent times, there is research still being published which says we sampled X thousand amount of people, and those who had 4 or more have experienced X, Y, and Z, cancer, or they smoke, or STIs, the usual kind of narrative that you see in this space. But what if you have 3 ACEs and you experience racism? What then? Or what if you just experience racism? What then? There is nothing really to equip us to understand what the experience therefore means in terms of trauma, in terms of adversity, and then in terms of policies and how we design services and how we dismantle some of these structural issues. There isn't anything there to help us with that. So I think, I often get asked to do training on trauma or trauma-informed foster care, for example, and I see services rolling out trauma-informed training across their whole organisation, across whole countries, nations in the UK. But my question is, I guess, to finalise what I'm saying is, what value is that if we don't understand structural racism, if we don't understand the impact of our biases? Whose trauma are we even talking about? If we look at the evidence base around a lot of this, it's been based on the experiences of dominant groups, Eurocentric perspectives, modalities, which again were developed by people who share a particular protected characteristic. And what does this mean for children and young people from black and minoritized backgrounds? I guess for me, the question we all need to be asking is, given the levels of diversity in this country, are we sufficiently equipped? Do we have enough knowledge to apply the ACEs evidence base to children who fall outside of dominant groups, whose identity is not that of a dominant group? Thank you very much.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Laurel. I think that's a really, really useful contribution, specifically around potential overgeneralizations of an evidence base without really understanding the nuance about what works, what the issues are for which groups, and also this issue around unconscious bias or even conscious bias per se in some of the interventions that are being developed, delivered and executed. Thank you. And also even in the collection of the evidence, which is also an issue, of course. So thank you so much for that. Dan, we come to you next for your contribution. Feel free to take your 5 to 8 minutes.
Thanks very much. And thanks to the previous 2 speakers. So I completely agree with everything that you've all said. It's a nice little echo chamber, this, so it makes things a lot easier. Basically, what I've written down duplicates a lot of what people have already said, so I'll try not to just repeat the same thing and freestyle a little bit, which is always dangerous, but we'll see how we go. I think I want to start with just coming clean and say that I do hold a really firm core belief that if children experience harm, difficulties are more likely in their later life. So everything about my own childhood told me that the school I went to, the kids I shared classes with, also my training as a psychologist in my practice. But that doesn't mean that harm can't lead to growth as well. There's truth in both, right? And we need to avoid this either or kind of thinking. The ACEs framework, I think, is just a small part of that kind of idea. That if we harm children, bad things happen. I think, as Kirsten said earlier, right? It's just a small part of a massive body of thinking, literature, science, evidence. elements. So you've got attachment, you've got trauma, you've got psychopathology, and I could keep on going on with the list. Racism, as Laurel has pointed to. And this is a small part, and it's become quite important in the last few years, but I think we need to just keep it to what it was originally intended to be. So there's 3 main points I want to make. The first is that when it comes to ACEs, its strength is always also its weakness to a certain extent. So the strength of the ACEs framework is that it communicates this idea in a really, really simple and accessible way. So accessible that even politicians can understand that. Sorry if there's anybody like this, I couldn't resist, right? But it can get that message across to people who wouldn't normally perhaps hear it or understand it or want to know that. Which is a good thing, right? Because there's still plenty of people out there who perhaps don't carry that belief or are aware of that idea. The trouble is that simplicity and that accessibility is also its limited. So it hasn't got really robust statistical analysis. It is only a correlation. It is only limited to 10. All these things are weaknesses, but if we try and move away from that original strength, we might lose some of the benefits to it. But for me, the problem with ACEs isn't what it is, it's how it's then used or implemented. So if it's used to help inform politicians or policymakers to think of harm and to think about protecting children and to think about responding afterwards, then fantastic, I welcome that. If it's used to determine practice in a classroom or a CAMS room or a school, then no, it shouldn't do that. It is far too limited to do that. And the classic example that I hear quite a lot is this idea of a primary school teacher who gives the children the ACEs questionnaire and asks them to fill it out, and then the kids compare the scores. That is absolutely awful. You know, we could talk all day about why we should do that, but I don't think the ACEs framework was ever intended to be used. I suppose the question then is, if it is being used to inform people, what then is the response? And I think, you know, Laurel's pointed to it, trauma-informed care is part of that, but so many other things. If we see that harm is happening, what then is the response in the here and now that can sort of help inform the way the practice occurs? And the analogy that I use is really, really bad, and I've been trying to think of a different one while Laurel was speaking, is that ACEs is almost like a gateway drug, right? I'm regretting saying this out loud, but it's like an introduction to this. But it doesn't do it all. We need to go and explore other things that can help inform practice and be more specific. I'm going to really regret that gateway drug analogy later. I think putting all that together, I'd summarise it with ACEs does have a role to play with this. It has a role to inform and sort of get some people on board. But it doesn't do much more than that. We've got other things that can help inform practice to a much greater degree. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think some of the key points there really around having an evidence base of some description and a simplistic way of thinking about it helps politicians and others latch onto the concept and certainly understand it, but actually it doesn't give you the finite detail that you need if you're going to be implementing interventions on the ground, and that's why a more nuanced and an improved evidence base is absolutely critical. So Vashti, and just before I bring Vashti in, if you do have your questions, start sending them through because we will come to questions straight after. Thanks. So Vashti, would you like to add your contribution?
Thank you, Kelly. And as Dan said, it's lovely to go last, actually, because lots of these points are just reiterations. Just for context, I undertake research in what's called an applied research collaboration, which is a funded partnership between the universities and health and social care providers in the different regions of England. So I'm based down in Exeter in Devon in the southwest. And the collaboration is really about producing research that produces meaningful action for policymakers and practice workers. And so I do a lot of work interfacing with private public sector organisations, third sector, hospital trusts, local authorities as such, and also obviously those with lived experience and service users themselves. And I spend a lot of time trying to translate this kind of evidence for their use, but also trying to listen to and hear the questions that we should be researching as we go forward. And I think in that context, the ACE agenda has been both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because of the things that Kirsten's pointed to, which is it's given increased profile and attention to vulnerable children and families where we really needed it. There's been more research, more discussion, more interaction on a really important issue. But a curse, I think, because the limits and the complexity of the evidence base make its translation very, very tricky, and the focus hasn't necessarily been in the right places, as we've heard already. So I wanted to pick up 3 points as well. We've all got 3 points, it seems. The first of which is this distinction between population-level evidence and individual-level identification and intervention. So as you all know, ACEs has its predictive strength in its aggregate conclusions, not in its individual application. And although the scoring framework and the screening tools and such can be helpful when used with caution to identify those with vulnerability, we don't actually know about the impact of those tools at all in terms of the potential harms that they may have. And as others have pointed out, individuals with high scores can go on to have very healthy lives. So there's hope for you, Laurel. And indeed, we know so little about how these ACEs cluster together as groups, what those things mean, and the prevalence of these groupings and the impacts of those interactions. And I think that's a real challenge for our kind of rather siloed service world, because they need applicable evidence to guide new system and service design. Down in Devon, some service partners did some recent analysis of their first-time entrance into the criminal justice system. And what they found is that all of the young people coming through had 5 or more ACEs. So the score itself wasn't discriminating or informative for individual young people's care. But when they looked on aggregate, what they found is that all of them shared 2 factors in particular. So childhood bereavement, they'd all lost someone close to them in their young lives, and domestic abuse. And this has led them to think a little bit more thoughtfully about what they can do in the early pathway in terms of prevention and early intervention in those 2 spaces. This links to my second point. So this distinction between universal prevention and targeted or indicated early intervention. We've seen that a lot of trauma-informed approaches to care, and there are different definitions of that, have really proliferated. And we've got workforce training, workforce development in different sectors, which in some cases has been, I think, hailed as kind of revelationary for practice, particularly in the police, for example, down here. But really what it's done, I think, in the Southwest, it's been credited with giving the workforce permission to be thoughtful and to connect with the humanity of service users, where the system has previously decontextualized them and othered them. And so most of the approaches that we've thought about, though, have started from a place of the trauma already having taken place. And I think there's much more that we can do in the prevention space, thinking about this before it even begins. I think the ACE evidence ought to be propelling us down a pathway of greater investment in prevention and resilience building. And that we, this is not the national agenda that it used to be. We see our public health and our early years services seriously underfunded by comparison. So work that looks at prevention and invests in prevention, it takes bravery. It's about the long game. It's about demonstrating outcomes in years to come from investment now. And I think we as a research community have a lot more that we could do to support providers and policymakers to really interrogate and demonstrate their record in that regard. And perhaps most importantly, to enable young people and children to participate in that agenda. The final point I want to make briefly, because it's already been really beautifully discussed by Laurel, is around structural inequality and adversity. So it's, the ACE framework is conspicuously silent about the impacts and importance of poverty and discrimination and privilege and power but these inequities really are run through the fabric of our society. I think system reform has to be at the heart of an ACE agenda. Our evidence base is pretty poor, though, in terms of guiding us on how best to do that. Down in Torbay in the southwest, they've put their response to ACEs as part of the local authorities' reducing inequalities corporate plan. And I think that really is about trying to reflect the importance of social determinants in understanding adversity. And what that's meant is really intentioned efforts to move away from what I think has been typically thought of as early intervention efforts, where of professionals parachuting in to do to children and families, and to rather elevate the voices of those with lived experiences and recognize distributed leadership. So involving neighborhoods and communities in creating solutions to their own difficulties. But there's also been challenges with that, because taking a trauma-informed approach can result in service or intervention suggestions that actually the system doesn't have the ability or funding or capacity to deliver. So an example of that might be some of the more intensive recovery interventions that actually need to last many years and span relationships between professionals and families over many, many years that the system doesn't have capacity to provide. And I think there are also perceived dangers around ACEs having been commodified under the new public management commissioning. So creating markets and competition for service contracts under this banner of vulnerability that we need to be aware of. And I would end just on saying that as an applied researcher, I think the thing that excites me most is that the strategy work in this application is really, at least in the Southwest and I'm sure elsewhere in the country, has been taking a more learning and development approach. So explicitly planning for learning and development from the outset. They're not looking to apply evidence in fixed ways. They aren't looking for us as researchers to say, here's what works on a platter as a panacea to your problems. So the kind of what works is really about what works, what is valued in what context and for whom. And things change and services need to adapt. And I think we as this research community will need to do the same.
Thank you very, very much, Vashti. Really helpful. Just shining a light on some of the complexities involved here and not oversimplifying both the use of the framework but also the broader evidence base. Useful points around prevention and early prevention of the trauma itself, and also some of those structural inequalities that Laurel also picked up on earlier. So thank you very much for that. We have had many questions flowing through as well for the panel. And so I will come to those. I will come to those now, actually, if that's all right. We've got about 25 minutes left for questions, and I will give opportunities for all. So just first question really around the screening for ACEs and the controversial nature of that. Just some comments that it's amazing this happens despite the lack of evidence, and yet there are people who are very strongly advocate for this practice. Can you discuss why this might be? Why are people strongly advocating for screening? What is the logic behind that? When I go to yourself first, Kirsten, is that all right?
Sure, I'll try to answer that. I think that the reason, first of all, as everybody has commented on, that the idea that you could count these things and have some predictive validity is quite appealing. And this is in the absence of having good, reliable ways of making treatment decisions or deciding who gets what. So I think that's the appeal, that when people read these studies and, even, within 5 years of them being published, there was a belief, now it wasn't really strongly supported in the ACEs research itself, but that when people were asked these questions, that there would be a light bulb moment where it's like, oh my God, that explains my past. I'll go seek help. They thought that they found this actually in the ACEs evidence, when in fact, we don't really see that in studies. The few evaluations that exist don't include the most vulnerable families. And so that's why we relied on the most robust ones, where it's like, no, we're not ready to talk to this new practitioner about this yet. That's what the most robust evidence is telling us right now. But from, a face value perspective, it looked very appealing. And so I think that that's why it's in widespread use right now.
So the simplicity of it, or any other panelists want to come in, Dan?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I think, I don't know the context down south as much as I do up here, but I think part of the will for that comes from the idea that there's many services that work with young people or adults who've had these experiences who don't acknowledge or recognise them in any way at all. And so this is kind of a response to that cynicism we need to acknowledge and recognise. There's obviously many better ways you can do it than giving someone a 10-item questionnaire and screening them in that way. And I think the sort of third way out of this for me is to give people the opportunity to tell services or those that they're working with if they choose to. And giving the opportunity is much different to asking someone to do a survey, right? That's much more in line with, the kind of human element that somebody mentioned earlier. And I think the phrase that gets used is routine inquiry. I think it's nice that we routinely give people the opportunity, but to screen is a different thing altogether.
Any thoughts, Vashti or Laurel? Vashti? I completely agree, Dan. I think this is about, wanting to support services to have those structured or facilitated conversations to build relationships, to listen and hear what people are saying, and to think. One of the things it has done is to kind of promote this idea that people are more than just the problem they're appearing to your service for. So a more holistic understanding of individuals' experience and context. But I think we should be moving and pushing an agenda that says, let's have these trusted relationships, let's have conversations and listen to people rather than, tick a box of 10 items and somehow that's going to tell us what we need to know.
Mm-hmm. So, Laurel?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think from a service level in terms of practice, I think this is an approach that is adopted across different areas. So whether we're talking about ACEs or child sexual exploitation or other forms of extrafamilial harm, people like to have assessments or some form of checklist, crudely, because it helps you allocate sufficient resource to that child or that family, so you know what level of intervention might be necessary or where you might need to go. I think it's sometimes deemed to be a helpful tool to aid the allocation of resources or sourcing of interventions, which obviously is quite flawed, but I just think from a practice perspective, people like lists and tick boxes and flowcharts to help you just, here's A and you go to B.
But now, one of the issues you raised earlier, Laurel, of course, is this issue of systemic racism and racial discrimination, which is not something particularly well picked up in this framework. But we're getting questions about that coming through around what can we suggest as a panel, or what are your thoughts on how issues of systemic racial discrimination could be appropriately factored into good planning for children in relation to ACEs, trauma and appropriate interventions? And who would like to pick that one up first?
I don't mind.
Laurel, you start. Yeah, okay.
I'll start at the macro and then work my way down to micro. So at a macro level, if you're kind of a policy maker or senior decision maker, you control the systems. It's about looking at your systems and identifying where there is bias built into those systems. What is the equalities impact of the way in which you are operating? Who is controlling your systems? What's the makeup of your systems leaders? Is it diverse? Are you getting diversity of identity of thought to enable you to even see where there is bias there? That is then developing practice or tools that are going to reinforce particular inequalities or experiences of oppression. And then as we come down to practice, what tools enable you to understand the way in which the identity of that child or that family is going to intersect and relate to their experiences of adversity or trauma or discrimination, structural discrimination. Quite often we have tick boxes which do nothing to enable curious thinking, to enable you to reflect on what you might be projecting into your practice. But in addition, in social work, for example, systemic practice gives you we have the social graces or other tools which try to help you reflect on your identity, but also the identity of the child and young person across other sectors. So I do some work in mental health, for example, where often there isn't a conversation. I come into contact with clinicians who adopt quite a purist approach and modality, and that when I start to have conversations with them to get thinking outside of that, it's an interesting conversation because they aren't used to thinking outside of that box. So I think you have to look at every level of your system, of your organisation. How can these recognise the identities of your children, young people and families, and then respond to them in a way where you can develop preventative services or other levels of intervention to meet the needs and mitigate the impact of these experiences.
Vashti, can I bring you in to comment on that as well, whether you have anything to add?
Laurel's outlined that beautifully in terms of what people can do. I think from a research perspective, there is much more we can do around understanding both in terms of the epidemiology of these, of how race and ethnicity intersect with experience of ACE, prevalence of ACE and impact of ACEs, but I think also in terms of our interventions. So we know very, very little about the relative benefits or harms of our early interventions for families from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. So having funding and having thought given to our research designs that enable us to understand whether people are accessing these things differently as a result, or indeed experiencing and their impact differently, I think is incredibly important as we go forward if we're going to really understand how to do this work well.
Okay, thank you. Now we're getting some other questions through about the evidence base for trauma-informed responses, so I'll just read some of these out. So I concur, sorry if you float back for me, I concur that the ACEs scoring approach is totally flawed. However, I'm interested in whether there's any evidence base for, can you bring it back? Thanks, for trauma-informed responses to childhood trauma, such as the ARC framework of attachment, resilience and competency. And as the individual who reviewed all of the evidence base, I'm curious whether you have a view on this, Kirsten.
Well, there's not a lot of robust evidence, again, partially because this is very new. Another thing I might just add right now is that ACEs and trauma-informed care actually evolved separately, but were joined up about 10 years ago. ACEs became the business case, as it were, for trauma-informed care, but it is a practice that has existed separately. We, in fact, are trying to investigate it ourselves now. And one of the issues with trauma-informed care is it is based on a set of principles rather than a specific practice, which makes it really difficult. So trauma-informed care practice or awareness, with a bunch of different names for it, may be different in different areas. And so it's not just one thing.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to evaluate something if it's not clearly defined. The other thing is that the outcomes that it's trying to achieve are also not always clearly stated. So from what we can tell, there are some elements of understanding the negative impact that trauma might have on children's development and their behavior at any given time. And I think that practitioners really value it just from that the ability to help them understand that what they're seeing at any given moment is maybe the tip of the iceberg of a variety of different things. Also gives, in some areas, we've seen it giving a set of tools for addressing those issues, which practitioners find quite helpful. But in the conversations that we've been having about it right now, I think what has really struck me is that it usually has a component that helps practitioners who are dealing with highly vulnerable people. They experience secondary trauma, and it gives their organization the space to discuss these things within their practice so that they feel better about what they're doing. And I think that these are important components. I think what has struck me about these components, though, is these have existed in practice actually before trauma-informed care, but we're seeing them in services where they were not part of routine practice. So that's an interesting thing, too. So we don't want to lose what seems to be really good improvements in practice, but there still is a lack of clarity about what they're trying to achieve. So right now we're mapping all 152 local authorities to see what they're doing and if they're doing anything in children's social care in this space. And then secondly, to find out what they perceive the benefits to be. And then hopefully we'll have some important elements better understood so we can then formally evaluate trauma-informed practice to see what it really is doing.
Thank you, Kirsten. Any others want to come in on the trauma-informed practice at all? Dan, yes.
Yeah. I'm just laughing because I've got the art book here. I don't know if you want to see it. I don't know. But, the evidence base isn't great. It is growing. But just to second some of Kirsten's points there, I mean, it is a set of principles. I suppose an analogy could be like the introduction of disability awareness, or they're trying to make the world better for people who are disabled. It's inherently, I think, a moral and good thing anyway. This is a bigger discussion, I think, but if we say that we're going to try and respond to people and empower people and give people choice and be trustworthy, these are all, I would argue, inherently good things to apply, and the outcomes of those things could be many. Some might be unintended and not so good. Others, I think, are going to be inherently good. In the same way that it's a good argument to just inherently make the world better for people in a wheelchair, then surely it is for people who've had that adversity. We could discuss that all day, but yeah, that's the short version.
And anyone else like to come in from the panel before we talk a little bit about positive childhood experiences and the interaction with ACEs?
Can I just...
Yes, please, Laurel.
Which I'm going to stick with this theme today. So I currently am based in London. In terms of our population, there's 55% who are from Black and minoritized backgrounds. I've been on numerous training courses on trauma in this city and never heard of racial trauma in any of these trainings. So for me, I think we have, but this is the inherent bias, the inherent structural inequality that I'm talking about, the oppression that people experience is born out of. At a basic level, we talk about trauma-informed schools, and this links to Vashti's point for me around the commodification. People are charging exorbitant amounts of money to deliver these programs and foster these trauma-informed workforces or organisations, but in a city as diverse as London, you do that and then you don't make reference to racial trauma. For me personally, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a clinician, but the two do not align. And especially when we see in America, Kenneth Vardy, Will McCalvert, there are people who are researching racial trauma and writing about it, offering us ways to mitigate the impact of what is going to be a lifelong experience. So I think when we talk about trauma-informed practice, as Kirsten said, we don't really have a clear definition, but what I think absolutely always needs to be an aspect or component of this is the consideration of whose trauma. Whose trauma are we actually talking about, and is your response inclusive for the diversity of identities that will come through your service?
Thank you, Laurel. Vashti, anything to add?
No, I think that's well.
It is indeed. So a question here about positive childhood experiences and whether anyone on the panel would like to comment on how that can interact with ACEs and potentially be a protective factor for children. And I'm curious about the evidence base on this. Is there an evidence base?
Well, a lot of people have talked about childhood resilience and the role resilience might play in mitigating the effect or impact of ACEs. The sad thing is that when we see children, I mean, there are studies that show that the higher number of ACEs that they have, greater adversity in their childhood or chronic adversity we're talking about, the less likely they are to be resilient. And this resilience often hinges on the ability to engage, really, to have a trusted relationship with an adult. And it becomes more difficult when you have had a childhood of adversity. So we need to be careful about how we think about these concepts. It's important that resilience, that we understand that some children are resilient. Most, in fact, some people argue that it's part of human nature, that there's a mechanism to make us resilient towards adversity. But we also we can't just throw that word around as if it's like some kind of syrup that you can take, the resilience syrup, that it's going to suddenly make you better. I think we need to understand how that works. What we do know from the interventions that are effective is that some of the ones that play a particularly have a particularly strong effect, provide children with skills for managing stress, for maybe reframing certain events that happen in their life, and looking at strengths and weaknesses within their own system and coming up with strategies to use their strengths to mitigate some of their own weaknesses. And it does involve being with adults and other peers that you trust. But it's not like, voila, you can give them a trusted adult, or putting a child in sports is going to make a difference. Even though some adults will say, well, yeah, retrospectively, I think going into sports helped me. That's a retrospective post hoc analysis of what took place. We don't necessarily know, for example, if sports actually mitigate the negative impact of ACEs.
Okay, thanks very much, Kirsten. And from our panel on the line, who would like to come in first on this one?
I'll follow up on what Kirsten was saying there. I think those are hugely important points, and also what we know from studies, the things that are often pointed to as protective factors, positive factors, now being called counter ACEs, I believe, are things like social support, trusted adults, community, and I think we do need to have a conversation about the extent to which the dialogue is kind of being framed around individual agency, and keep bringing in the perspective of community and neighborhood strength here. Because, as Kirsten said, this is not about a kind of a syrup for an individual that somehow vaccinates them against adversity. But what we do know is that you can build strong communities, you can build strong supportive networks that can support many individuals in different ways, and that those things require us to look at those structural inequalities rather than individual experiences. They are harder, certainly by far, to intervene with and to create programs of work around, which is why I think we often grab at the simplistic individual answers, and interventions tend to focus around individuals or families. But I think if we are going to talk about protective factors, we have got to start looking at the things that we can do in our communities and neighbourhoods, and how those things play a part in this.
Thank you. Dan, will I bring you in for some comment on this as well?
Yeah, I think agree with all points again. We obviously, just societal and the sectors, we love looking at the negatives, right? We love putting all the money into that. Let's look at all the doom and gloom. And there's so much more to be learned about what helps, what we should be doing. Not in just terms of like therapy, but in terms of the whole, as Ashley said, the wider sort of web, if you like. And I think quite often this narrative gets turned into something quite simple, which is, we do the opposite. Where there's neglect, we give nurture and care. Where there's chaos, we give predictability. And, I do kind of subscribe to that, but there's loads more detail and nuance that we need to explore within that. That I think is hopefully the next phase that this literature and science is going to move into.
And Laurel, anything to add? No? Okay. So we've time probably for two more questions. So I'll take one more off the board and then one of my own, which I want to ask. So I have chair's privilege. Would it be that ACE-led services ensure workers ask what has happened and to find solutions and opportunities to undo that damage rather than individualise blame? And that, I cannot see who the questions are from, but does that make sense to the panel as a question? Not particularly. It's about ACE-led services ensuring that people are not individualising blame and more thinking around solutions and opportunities to undo the damage. Perhaps something around practitioner practice.
Well, yeah, I mean, you would see, and I think that this is a positive thing about trauma-informed care, is that, for example, when children are having certain behavioural difficulties at school, they automatically get excluded. That would be a form of individualizing blame. And I think one of the positive things we've seen happening in the name of trauma-informed care is that they stop excluding pupils. Well, we've never seen any evidence showing that exclusion actually improves outcomes for these children. It blames them for what they're doing and in fact makes it more possible for them to do it again. So if asking a child what happened to them and trying to get underpin that helps that. But we need to think about how we do that and make sure that there's some training is a strong word, but that you just don't casually ask these things too, and then just kind of throw it away, and then there needs to be some very careful consideration. And so, yes, I do think that there is a role for this, but we need to think carefully how that would work.
Okay. Anyone else like to comment on that? Dan, you?
Yeah, I think if someone's trying to make a decision about whether they should give someone the opportunity to share these things with them, the criteria for that, I think, is if the professional, the person feels able to hear that in a way that the person who's sharing it feels glad that they shared it and feels like something useful is going to come out of that. If we can't fulfill that criteria, then we risk being counterproductive, I think.
Vashti or Laurel, anything to add? No? Then I get, Laurel, sorry? No? Okay, perfect. Then I get to add my question. So it'd be amiss of us not to ask about the sort of COVID impact on the ACES agenda. And I'm sitting here today being out of the house for the first time in weeks, very excited. But I would like to ask just for your reflections on what this has done to the ACES agenda and what policy and practice needs to do perhaps to evolve in this new context and this additional challenge. And who would like to go first? I'm assuming there is a limited evidence base around given it is relatively new.
Yeah, and there are two things to say about that. One is, I think, from my work in this area, it seems like it's suspended it. People are talking about COVID. They're talking about trauma in the context of COVID. And I think that that's probably helpful because nobody saw this coming. Nobody knew what kind of trauma this would be. And so just to obviously COVID probably increases the likelihood of certain ACEs. We know that, in fact, that it is. But they're not talking about this ACE framework and how many are happening. At least that not in this is anecdotal. The other thing is there has been over the last year, since the publication of our report, some ongoing serious criticism of the framework and the counting and the screening, et cetera. We were one of the earlier reports, but particularly in the United States and Canada, where they have introduced this much more formally, in the state of California in particular, that there has been, where they've invested quite a bit too, there has been some criticism. So it'll be interesting how that plays out in the bigger debate. What is interesting about California is that they are using this score, and they've been severely criticized on it, but that score does lead to some of the best interventions that are available. So pros and cons in that approach.
Thank you, Kirsten. And who would like to come in next, Vashti?
Sure, yes. I mean, I think just kind of thinking about the ACEs themselves, I mean, there's certainly evidence to suggest that during this COVID period and the kind of restrictions that have followed as a result, there has been increases in probably all of those ACEs. So we've seen, rates of domestic abuse increase. We've seen children's mental health get poorer. And also, I guess, a reduced access in terms of support. So just going back to our conversation earlier about the protective factors or the positive elements of children and young people and families' lives, a reduction in some of those things that we know create strength for families in terms of the social connection and community, and the ability of services to link with families. So, we've seen health visiting, social care, primary care being unable to have face-to-face visits, to be able to have those connections. So I think that loss of connectivity and empathy in the system is probably something to worry about as well, and almost certainly will have had an impact. I don't think at the moment we've got evidence to really understand the nature of that impact, but it will be important as we go forward.
Thank you. And then Dan, and then Laurel, and then we will wrap up. Dan.
I mean, it's pretty much all been COVID for the last, forever basically, hasn't it? I think we've been trying to really robustly implement trauma-informed care, and it felt like the world stopped for most of the time then. We're just trying to cope with COVID. I think what I'm really interested in is there's some natural experiments here, isn't there? And for some of the young people that we look after, we notice that their behavior, the concerns that we have about them really decreased during COVID. And that is something that we would never have created on purpose, but allows us to explore, well, what actually is it that we're trying to do that in the daily lives of children that perhaps isn't being helpful and actually maybe contributing to these issues. That's all I've got to say on.
Thank you. And Laurel?
Yeah, it's just, I guess, to echo the points raised by Vashti and Kirsten, largely around, we know there will have been an increase in a range of incidents during this period, DV, as Vashti just mentioned, loss and bereavement, especially if you're from particular groups, ethnic groups, gender. And so I think this is an opportunity for services, for regions, organisations to really adopt some of the approaches that we talk about or we aspire to as they develop their recovery efforts, because we all have to be developing some form of recovery effort if we are still working on the ground. And it offers us opportunity to capacity build communities, to ask children what happened rather than judge their behaviour when they are returning to school following consistent periods of 2 weeks at home, back at school, 2 weeks at home, back at school. So I think we should really take this as an opportunity to really look at how we can prevent ACEs. If there's nothing else that we know for sure about the agenda, we all agree they're bad. So how in our response moving forward can we use this as an opportunity as we recover from COVID to, take that asset-focused approach and try and support in a different way.
Thank you very much. That was a perfect ending point. So thank you very much for summing it up so nicely. And I think today's session has been really useful just to talk through some of the strengths and limitations of the frameworks that are used, the weaknesses within the evidence base. And so we're all acutely aware of some of the other things that need considered when we're looking at ACEs, both in implementation and evidence. So thank you everybody very much for joining us. Thank you for participating. Thanks to all our panelists for their comments and insights, and we will now break for lunch, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock for the later afternoon session. So thanks to everybody, and this session will be available online after. So take care. Thanks.